In 1946, a new government north of the 38th parallel did something almost no country on earth had dared to do that year. It put gender equality into law before it even declared itself a nation. Marriages arranged for cash, concubines kept as property, brothels operating in the open. All of it, officially, wiped from the books in a single decree. And yet, 80 years later, that same government will sentence a 16-year-old girl to 12 years of hard labor for the crime of watching a romance drama. How does a state that once abolished forced marriage end up executing people for falling in love with the wrong kind of story? By the end of this video, you will see the full arc. From feudal concubines, to socialist equality on paper, to famine, to a hidden generation quietly rewriting the rules of intimacy under the nose of the world's most controlled government. Stay until the end, because the most surprising part of this story is not the past. It is what is happening right now, in 2026, inside North Korea's private markets and secret media rooms. North Korea is usually described in headlines as a nuclear state, a dictatorship, a country of parades and missile tests. Rarely is it described as a place with its own hidden history of romance, marriage, gender roles, and sexuality. But that history exists, and it matters, because nothing reveals how a society actually works more than how it governs love, marriage, and bodies. Sexuality is never separate from politics. It is shaped by war, by economics, by propaganda, and by the choices ordinary people make even when the state is watching. In North Korea's case, that history runs from Confucian tradition through Soviet-inspired socialist reform, through a devastating famine that broke the state's grip on daily life, into a modern era of smuggled dramas, underground markets, and a generation the regime cannot fully control. Today, we are going to trace that journey decade by decade. We will look at where it started, the laws that reshaped it, the quiet revolution of the 1990s market economy, and where North Korea's relationship with sex, gender, and intimacy may be heading next. This is not a story you will find on state television. And it is not a story most outsiders ever hear, because it lives in the gap between official propaganda and the private lives people build in spite of it. To understand North Korea's sexual history, you first have to understand the world it was born out of. Centuries of Confucian tradition on the Korean peninsula. Under that system, women were expected to be dutiful daughters, then dutiful wives, then dutiful mothers in that order, with almost no independent legal identity. Marriages were arranged, often for economic or political advantage rather than affection, and a wife's status depended entirely on producing a male heir. Divorce was rare and heavily stigmatized against women, and a divorced woman often faced permanent social exile from respectable society, regardless of the circumstances that led to the separation. At the top of society existed the kiseng system, a class of highly trained female entertainers who provided music, conversation, and, in many elite settings, sexual companionship for aristocrats and officials. It functioned much like the geisha tradition in Japan, an institution that packaged female sexuality as a service for the powerful, while ordinary women had virtually no sexual autonomy at all. Polygamy and concubinage were legal realities for wealthy men, and a woman's virginity before marriage was treated as a matter of family honor rather than personal choice. Education for girls was minimal, and their economic survival depended almost entirely on marriage, since very few paths existed for a woman to support herself independently. Christian missionaries in the 19th century opened some of the first girls' schools on the peninsula, offering a narrow but real exception to this pattern, and giving a small number of young Korean women their first access to formal education outside the home. This was the world that still existed on the Korean peninsula when Japanese colonial rule ended in 1945 and Soviet troops moved into the northern half of the country. It is important to note that under Japanese occupation, hundreds of thousands of Korean women were also forced into sexual slavery as so-called comfort women for the Japanese military. A historical trauma that shaped Korean attitudes toward sexuality, nationalism, and foreign domination for generations afterward, well into the modern era, on both sides of what would soon become a divided peninsula. That trauma, and the desire to break completely with everything the old order represented, would help explain why the new government in the North moved so fast and so aggressively once it came to power. Everything changed in the space of about 18 months. In 1945, before North Korea even formally existed as a state, local authorities under Soviet occupation abolished the traditional patrilineal household registration system that had locked women into subordinate legal status. Then, on July 30th, 1946, the new government passed what is now called the Gender Equality Law, officially the Law of Equal Rights for Men and Women. On paper, it was radical. It gave women equal rights to inheritance, marriage, divorce, child custody, and property division. It banned polygamy and concubinage outright, condemning them as feudal relics that jeopardized the human rights of women. It abolished the kiseng system entirely, closing the schools and houses that had trained and employed those entertainers for centuries. And it criminalized prostitution and brothels, both public and private, imposing legal punishment on anyone who continued to operate them. This was not simply moral reform, it was ideological. North Korea's founders, inspired by Marxist-Leninist theory, framed traditional Korean family structures as feudal relics that had to be destroyed to build a truly socialist society. Women were reframed not as property inside a household, but as workers and citizens with a role in building the new state. The government paired this legal shift with major land reform and the nationalization of industry, so the transformation of gender roles was bundled together with a total transformation of the economy. For the first time, a Korean woman could legally divorce an abusive husband, inherit property in her own name, and could not be sold into marriage or concubinage. Later constitutions, in 1972 and again in 1990, reaffirmed that women held equal social status with men and directed the state to actively create conditions for women's advancement in society. Two women in particular were elevated as ideological symbols of this new order. Kang Ban-sok, the mother of founding leader Kim Il-sung, and Kim Jong-suk, his first wife, both celebrated in state propaganda as models of revolutionary womanhood, presented to the public as proof that a woman could be both devoted mother and devoted revolutionary at the same time. Legal scholars, who have studied the original decree, note that its language went out of its way to frame these changes as a total rupture with what it called medieval and feudalistic relationships. Language chosen deliberately to signal that there could be no partial compromise with the old order. It is one of the most striking contradictions in North Korea's history. A state that would go on to become one of the most repressive on earth began its existence by dismantling, at least in law, centuries of patriarchal sexual and marital tradition. But laws on paper and life inside households are two very different things, and this is where North Korea's story gets more complicated. Even as the gender equality law technically freed women from feudal customs like arranged and purchased marriages, deeply rooted cultural expectations did not disappear. They simply reorganized themselves around socialism. Scholars have described this as the survival of a kind of socialist version of the old Confucian hierarchy. Men were still expected to lead. Women were still expected to serve. Only now the language used to describe it was revolutionary rather than traditional. Women were pulled into the labor force in large numbers, and access to education expanded dramatically, with state-run nurseries and childcare centers designed explicitly to free women to work outside the home and contribute to industrial production. Propaganda from the 1970s praised women who balanced factory work, farm labor, and child rearing as heroines of the revolution, and official media regularly celebrated women who exceeded production quotas as proof that the new system had truly liberated them. At the same time, a strong cultural preference for sons persisted, girls and boys were often separated in schools from an early age, and household labor remained overwhelmingly a woman's responsibility, no matter how many hours she had already spent at her job outside the home. Sexuality itself became something the state wanted heavily managed and largely invisible in public life. Romantic and erotic expression in film, literature, and music was tightly filtered through revolutionary themes, with love stories almost always framed as secondary to loyalty toward the leader and the state. Open displays of physical affection were culturally discouraged in public, and officially, virginity before marriage remained an expectation for women, even though the same standard was rarely enforced for men. Meanwhile, generational differences began to quietly emerge. Older North Koreans, who remembered the pre-1945 world, held onto Confucian norms even as they praised the new laws, while their children were raised entirely inside a socialist education system that treated gender equality as an assumed fact of daily life, even if the reality inside their own homes told a more complicated story. By the 1980s, this generational gap was already visible to outside observers, who noted that younger, urban, more educated North Koreans described relationships in more egalitarian terms than their parents did, even while the same rigid state structures shaped both generations equally in public life. State media of the era rarely acknowledged this gap directly, preferring to present North Korean family life as a settled, harmonious model for the socialist world, even as internal reports and later defector testimony described ongoing tension between official gender equality and the private expectations still placed on women inside the home. And North Korea entered a period widely known as the Arduous March, a famine that killed hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million people, and shattered the state's ability to provide food, employment, and daily structure to its citizens. This is the pivot point of the entire story. Before the famine, the state controlled nearly every aspect of economic and social life, including where people worked, what they earned, and how households were structured around the centrally planned economy. During the famine, that system broke down almost entirely, and ordinary people, especially women, began operating unofficial markets known as jangmadang to survive, buying, selling, and trading food and goods outside of any state plan. Because men were still nominally required to report to state jobs that no longer paid or provided anything of real value, it was overwhelmingly women who built and ran this informal market economy. And in doing so, women quietly became the primary breadwinners in a huge number of North Korean households for the first time in the country's history. This economic shift had enormous consequences for gender roles and relationships. Marriages increasingly became partnerships shaped by economic survival rather than romantic or state-approved ideals, and many marriages functioned outside official registration altogether, since formal state processes mattered less than a couple's practical ability to survive together. Divorce, while still socially stigmatized and difficult to obtain through official channels, became more common in practice as economic pressure strained households in ways state ideology had never accounted for or prepared people to handle. Some reports from this period also describe North Korean men, stripped of their traditional breadwinning role and often left without formal employment, paying a portion of their absent wages to their official workplace simply to be excused from showing up, freeing themselves to pursue unofficial income elsewhere, while their wives ran the household economy. Perhaps most significantly, the space created by economic informality also opened a crack for smuggled foreign media, mostly arriving through the Chinese border, to enter the country on cassette tapes, then CDs, then USB drives and micro SD cards, carrying South Korean films, music, and dramas that depicted romance, dating, and sexuality in ways completely unlike anything sanctioned by North Korean state media. For a population raised on revolutionary love stories where romance was subordinate to loyalty to the state, this was the first real exposure many North Koreans had to modern ideas about dating, courtship, and sexual autonomy, and it planted seeds that the regime is still fighting to uproot today. Border guards and market inspectors became key figures in this new landscape, often paid off with bribes to look the other way, which meant that access to foreign media and the freedoms that came with it were increasingly shaped by wealth and connections, rather than official ideology alone. Fast forward to the past decade, and the contrast between official ideology and lived reality has only grown sharper. The generation that came of age after the famine, often called the Jangmadang generation, grew up trading in markets rather than depending entirely on the state. And researchers who study North Korean defectors describe this cohort as noticeably more individualistic, more skeptical of propaganda, and far more exposed to foreign culture than their parents' generation ever was. Smuggled South Korean dramas and music became genuinely popular among North Korean youth, teaching them not just entertainment, but vocabulary, fashion. Reports from defectors describe young couples adopting South Korean-style dating behaviors, more casual physical affection in private, and language borrowed directly from Korean dramas to talk about love, sometimes using slang so distinctly South Korean that using it in public has itself become a marker authorities look for. The regime has responded not with persuasion, but with extraordinary legal force. In December 2020, North Korea passed the law on rejecting reactionary ideology and culture, which criminalizes the possession, viewing, or distribution of South Korean media, with penalties ranging from 5 to 15 years of hard labor for possession, up to life imprisonment or death for large-scale distribution. Reports collected by human rights organizations and defector-linked groups describe teenagers publicly sentenced to over a decade of hard labor for watching K-pop videos, and claims of public executions for distributing South Korean dramas and music on USB drives, staged deliberately in front of large crowds as a warning to others. 2 additional laws passed in 2021 and 2023 expanded this framework further, together forming what defectors and researchers now call North Korea's 3 evil laws, an unprecedented legal architecture built specifically to police cultural and, by extension, sexual and romantic influence from the outside world. Kim Jong-un himself has publicly condemned K-pop as what he called a vicious cancer spreading through North Korean society, language that signals just how seriously the regime views this as an existential threat rather than a minor cultural nuisance. On LGBTQ issues, the picture remains murky by design. Homosexuality has never been explicitly criminalized in North Korean statute. The topic is simply treated as if it does not exist, absent from law, education, and public discourse entirely, while unverified reports from human rights groups describe harsher informal treatment in practice, including unconfirmed claims of executions in isolated cases. Meanwhile, the age of consent under the criminal code is set at 15 regardless of gender. Marriage is legally defined only as a union between one man and one woman, and no legal recognition exists for same-sex relationships of any kind, civil unions, or domestic partnerships. What all of this reveals is a state locked in an increasingly difficult contradiction. An economy that depends on informal markets it cannot fully control, feeding a generation with more access to outside ideas about love and sexuality than any before it, met by a government responding with some of the harshest cultural laws in the world. Defectors who left the country in the past few years describe a striking generational split, even within families, with parents anxious about the risks their children are taking, and children increasingly willing to take those risks anyway, treating access to outside culture as worth the danger involved. So where does this story go from here? Most North Korea researchers agree on one thing. The state's ability to fully seal off outside cultural influence is weakening, not strengthening, no matter how severe the legal penalties become. Smuggling networks tied to the informal market economy have proven remarkably resilient even through border closures during the pandemic. And demand for foreign media among younger North Koreans appears to keep rising even as punishments escalate, suggesting the appetite for a different vision of relationships and self-expression cannot simply be legislated away. At the same time, the regime under Kim Jong-un has shown no willingness to relax its approach, if anything tightening it further with each new law since 2020, and continuing to link foreign romantic and sexual content specifically to ideological betrayal of the state and its leadership. This creates real tension for the future. Economic necessity keeps pushing more women into breadwinning roles that quietly undercut old patriarchal assumptions embedded in both the pre-1945 tradition and the socialist system that replaced it. Informal markets keep exposing young North Koreans to outside ideas about dating and gender. And yet the legal environment around anything resembling foreign-influenced romance or sexuality keeps getting harsher, rather than more permissive. Analysts who study North Korean defector testimony suggest that generational change may eventually force some kind of quiet accommodation, simply because a government cannot indefinitely punish an entire generation's private behavior without real consequences for long-term social stability. Others argue the opposite, that increased internal surveillance technology, tighter monitoring of digital devices, and reinforced border controls since the pandemic mean the state may actually be more capable of enforcing conformity than at any point since the economic chaos of the 1990s. What is clear is that North Korea's sexual and social history has never moved in one direction. It has zigzagged from liberation to control to crisis to quiet rebellion and back to control again. And the coming years will likely be defined by which side of that tension wins out: the economic and cultural forces reshaping ordinary lives from below, or the legal and political forces trying to reassert control from above. Whatever direction it takes, the outcome will not be decided by a single decree from Pyongyang, but by millions of small private choices made in markets, in bedrooms, and in front of hidden screens, choices the state can punish, but has never fully been able to prevent. When you step back and look at the whole arc, the story of sexuality and gender in North Korea is really the story of North Korea itself in miniature. It begins with a genuinely radical promise: the abolition of concubines, forced marriage, and legalized inequality, delivered by a government eager to prove it represented a total break with the past. It moves through decades where that promise coexisted uneasily with old patriarchal habits dressed in new revolutionary language, habits the state never fully confronted, even as it claimed to have eliminated them. It is reshaped almost beyond recognition by a famine that no law had prepared anyone for, one that quietly handed economic power to women, even as it stripped away the state's ability to control daily life in ways its founders could never have imagined. And it arrives today at a strange, intense modern chapter, where a hidden generation absorbs foreign ideas about love and identity through smuggled dramas and hidden USB drives, while their government responds with some of the most severe cultural laws on the planet. Few countries reveal the collision between ideology and human nature quite as starkly as North Korea does. So here's the question worth sitting with. Do you think this transformation, from feudal tradition to socialist equality on paper to underground cultural rebellion, has actually improved life for ordinary North Koreans? Or has it simply replaced one set of controls with another? Do you think this transformation truly improved society, or did it create entirely new challenges? Whatever your honest answer turns out to be, one thing seems fairly certain: the private lives of ordinary North Koreans will keep changing quietly, one small choice at a time, long after the cameras and the headlines have moved on to the next missile test. Share your opinion below.